In this video, we're going to go over how I went about creating my entry for Corvus Belli's Infinity Painting competition. I'm going to be going into my full process, drawing inspiration, telling a story, my somewhat unconventional approach that might just help you in your next piece, and sprinkled along the way will be my top tips for creating these mini vinaigrettes. So, stick around for this month's Journey in Paint. We start with going deep, looking at all the lore. I need to find out everything I can, learn all the nuances of the world, and determine everyone's exact motivations. So I went online, and I went to Infinity's web store. I scoured deep and hard to find exactly what I was looking for. A mini I liked the look of. That's it. You don't need to know masses on the lore, you just need to find a model you like the look of. The lore and understanding can come later. For this, I chose Cassandra, a nomadic space nun. That seemed pretty cool to me. She has some interesting volumes. I'm using a selection of bases here from Tarot to find one that feels right to me. Solid advice here is to use the golden ratio of base to model to draw focus. Either the model or the base should be about 1.6 times larger than the other. I'm trying each of the bases one after the other to see what feels right to me, eyeballing it to about the golden ratio. After narrowing them down to two, a rounded one and one with rounded corners, the rounded corners ones feels like I'm going to have more space to work with, so I'm going to take that one going forwards. Now, what story are we trying to tell? For this, I like to look at the mini first. The Cassandra model has a cape that swooped forwards. We can therefore have her moving backwards, where she first moves and then the cape follows her, or we can put her in a zero gravity environment, where she's moving forward and coming to a stop before the cape comes and swoops around her. Kinda like how your hair moves underwater. Everything is now put to one side and I turn on Mass Effect. Now, we didn't just do that to have fun, but to get some inspiration for the environment. I can't visualize things in my head, so being able to see something that is visually similar to the world I'm trying to create is very helpful. I have seared into my memory the images of Harvel and its bluey ambience. Let's see what we can draw from this. I'm going to take a few screenshots as I'm exploring around. I've drawn out a few concepts for how I want the elements to appear, some more complex than others. I draw out a few designs for steps, struts, panels and flooring. They don't need to be great quality drawings, just something to set the mood. I mix and match from different bits and ideas to come up with something I can make. Note that I don't actually ever end up drawing this whole thing out in advance, as I don't feel like I need to. This totally won't come back and bite me in the ass, right? With the concept done, construction can start on the wall. I chop out the shapes I need from 0.5mm thick plastic card. First, cutting into a strip of plastic about 15mm wide. The main central span is cut to length about 30mm and shaped off, and at the same time a second, shorter strip is cut as well. Using the guides on the mat, I mark out and chop the second strip vaguely in half at an angle, and I then put them together, cutting them down to make them the same size. Everything is dry fitted, and I cut a notch out the main body where the front angles come up. I then cut out a section that gives some difference in height, just to break up the silhouette. Take your time here, it's not really advisable to snap this. I tidy up the cut with the edge of my knife blade before dry fitting again. Finishing off this part of the wall, I cut some 3mm wide strips before cutting them down and dry fitting these to the bottom of the supports, where the struts will go, to add some additional support. With everything cut, I can finally start to commit with glue. Firstly, the main angles are glued on with a generous dob of Tamiya extra thin, and then the bottom accents are added in the same manner. Everything is lined up and test fitted on the base before I come in with the final two cuts. The first one is to set the angle of the steps at which you'll be at. I just chose something that felt about right. Make sure your glue is dry first before doing this. Another cut is made 90 degrees to this one on the bottom, so there's a wider surface area to attach onto. These cuts are cleaned up with a knife before all of the cuts around the outside are smoothed out with a bit of Tamiya extra thin again. The steps follow the same process as the wall, cutting everything out and dry fitting it before coming in with Tamiya extra thin. Starting with the chopping of the accent of the supports, we cut strips about 3mm wide again, which we can use for later. The main body of the steps is about 10mm wide by 20mm long, with the corners cut off at one end to add some variety. 2 small strips of plasticard on the underside will help us to anchor this onto the wall later. Before we finish off with the accents, taking the strips and wrapping them around the end of the steps. You can always make this oversized and chop it down later. I make 3 steps in total, 2 of which are nearly identical in size and 1 of which is just much smaller to sit on top. I make sure they are slightly oversized so they can snap later to give them a broken look. For the struts, I picked up a couple of hollow metal tubes from Fen Model Show. They are both cut to the approximate size. The shorter one is the full length I require and the larger one is about half this length. I'd recommend using a saw for metal like this, as I struggle to get them into each other after this. The shorter one is then inserted into the larger one and is attached together with a dob of superglue. We test it just to see how it goes. Next we have the frame. A single long strip is cut about 3mm wide. This is rarely seen in the final piece due to poor positioning, but as they're easy to make, let's go through the process. This strip is cut to varying lengths, which will make up the frame. Don't worry about making them all the same size, they can always be cut down later. We will vary up the straightness of the cuts later. We are going to be trying to make triangles of different sizes. This is due to the strength of triangles when it comes to bracing, so it feels like it belongs. You can see as I'm going through that the triangles are starting to appear. Not many of them are complete, but that's okay. It's broken after all. There wouldn't be many that are left in one piece still. After the shape is made, we start to deform it, just bending sections to make it look broken. Try and avoid bending them all in the same direction, and don't bend all of them. With the main elements created, it's time to move on to assembling the whole base. We don't just place random elements over the place, rather we need natural order behind the randomness. So, building it up in the following layers gives us this. First, we define the basic shape, and then we apply basic textures on top of it. Then, anything embedded into the textures can be applied. Grass and tufts can then be added after, fresh elements like debris or new stones, and finally, the finishing touches of leaves or environmental effects. This is just a rough order to follow. Exactly how you go about it is up to you. Don't be afraid to do a couple of the same steps simultaneously. I start with putting my frame down on the base and pushing milliput all over it, covering most of my hard work, but I can't really think of another way to make it organically fit. Bits are however left sticking through the milliput towards the end. I keep applying the milliput to build up the volumes, and I start pushing all the big terrain elements into them that the environment's going to be textured around, the wall and the strut for example. With the main elements in position, they need a bit more milliput around them to hold them in place. This way they're going to be held nice and tightly in position. For this I apply little snakes of milliput and just put them in the bottom before smoothing them out with my sculpting tool and water. I take the opportunity to finish construction of the steps as well. I then position the first step, pressing it firmly into the milliput to lock it into position. The second step needs a home now. I go to attach it, but discover I don't like how the whole thing is being cantilevered off the edge. It feels too flimsy. So I stick a strip of a thin plasticard into the milliput to act as a second support point later. I add one final bit of texture with the milliput to the base, this being a small balls of milliput cut in half and then squished flat. This is going to get me some smooth rocks that will show through towards the end. Kind of like they've been eroded by decades of people walking on them before the place came to a ruin. I feel like I'm missing a bit of larger broken elements on the base, a quick bit of super glue here and there to attach everything, just to give us a solid bond. And with that, we're all happy, right? So, remember when I said that not drawing out the whole base would come back to bite me, and that the base looks different in the final piece? Well, I didn't like how Cassandra was placed in relation to the steps anymore, so I pulled it all out the milliput when it was half dry twisted it by 45 degrees and pushed it back in together. I had to put a stone under the first step to hide the attachment point of Cassandra now. I feel like this worked out for the better in the end. I stick a few cork stones into the base with super glue, and then we can start to come over and cover this with texture paste. I'm using Scale 75's Spring Soil. I'm adding additional textures here and there, not just covering everything. I'm leaving the smooth rocks showing through, I'm leaving some of the debris showing through. Remember, these are meant to be embedded into the soil and the ground. A little bit of water on the brush helps to smooth out the undulations to bring it more in scale with Cassandra. Large undulations are going to feel unnatural in this case. I then start to place larger cork rocks into the paste as it's drying. No need for me to glue them in, the texture paste should hold them in there nice and firmly. Finally, it's time to position Cassandra, drilling her foot for a pin and positioning that on a step where I want her. It took me a couple of attempts to get the position I liked. Subtle adjustments were needed so that she was engaging with both steps. With that, everything is cured and dried and we can start the painting process. Everything is primed with the airbrush. I then come in with dark sea blue and a magenta to start underpainting, putting highlights and defining where the light sources is, just to set a general mood. When the underpainting is done, we have a choice of painting the model or the base. I went with the base, and I recommend you do too. This is really my big learning from this. Why imagine the environment that model is going to be in when we can define it and paint it up front? With all of that known, it's easier to explore secondary reflections down the line and in the future. Give it a try on your next big piece. Set the mood, painting the base first. Thanks to the magic of YouTube, however, I'm going to show you Cassandra being painted first. But before that, YouTube really likes it when you drop a like and subscribe. If you've come this far, it would really help me out if you could do that. Cassandra has started off with getting the overcoat coloured. For this, I'm using a mix of hull red and dark sea blue. The dark sea blue is going to become a recurring theme, as it's going to be my universal shadow colour. If it's a shadow, it's going to have some dark sea blue mixed into it. I make sure I get full coverage with a couple of thin coats. When it comes to highlighting this, I have two sections. The base section, which is going to be receiving bounce light from the white surface she's standing on, and the main zenithal light source. Taking pure whole red, the high sections of the folds are painted, keeping the paint nice and thin. The high surface are picked out all over the model, leaving the base just showing in the darkest recesses. I then come back in with wine red and just draw and stipple some texture all over the folds, adding some more visual interest to the overcoat. It's now time to start focusing on the zenithal areas of the highlight. My original plan here was to highlight this up to the extreme with a light source in the environment, kind of like the goblins I've done. However, this ended up feeling too far off and needed to be corrected later. I've left it in, however, as some of this does influence the tones towards the end. This was just a mix of wine red and sky blue in about a 50-50. The correction here was to come back in over the top of this mix with Chimera's the red and Arctic blue, covering all the lovely section of purples I defined beforehand with this mix. The small advantage here is you can see easily how wide the highlights are. The metallic sections are painted by my tried and tested method of steel, using dark sea blue and Arctic blue. A base layer of pure dark sea blue is placed down, making sure to get some good coverage. I start to position the highlights following the folds of the cloth. I also add a few other highlights, as the metallic bits will have some counter reflections to them. Think of this as the light bouncing along the surface at this stage. It's then a process of working up the tones, mixing in more and more Arctic blue to the dark sea blue. Purposefully kept the coverage here quite wide. Cassandra in the box art seems to have this more focus towards the white rather than pure metallic, so I wanted to emulate this a bit. Every time I'm applying my highlight, I'm making sure it sits within the previous one, and I'm glazing over the transition a little bit. Equally as important at this stage here is to make sure it's all edge highlighted. We need this to appear as a coherent piece rather than just small islands of colour. This is a great little tip for non-metallic metal in general. Before I get to the pure Arctic blue, I'm looking at it and wondering where's my contrast gone. So I come back in with a very thin glaze of dark sea blue. This glaze is going to go over white, so it's going to show everything very easily. While the dark sea blue is on my palette, I also take the opportunity to redefine some of the lines down the centre of the back. With the shadows back, we can now move on to the specular highlights with pure Arctic blue, doing a few edge highlights here and there, keeping the paint thin so the transitions are not so stark. They are coming towards the top section where the zenithal light is coming from. I'm painting this mini in sections, so this recipe and method was used for all sections that are going to appear white in the end. I want to have two different types of red here that feel distinct and different from each other. While the first one was a darker desaturated red, the second I want to have a more vibrant pop to it. I want it to be part of the inner clothing after all. For this, I start with a base coating of wine red. Take your time to avoid areas you've already painted. This is critical for painting in sections. I then go in with the red from Chimera, focusing towards the tops of the folds using very thin layers, doing each one multiple times, slightly less and less coverage each time, mixing in a bit of Arctic blue into it as well, and I don't like how this looks. It feels too similar to the cape. To fix this, I mix Mars orange into the red, going over and rebuilding all the highlights. I do a few layers of this, steadily building in more and more Mars orange until I'm at pure Mars orange. Now there's another problem. This is orange, not red. Glaze over the top of it with the red. I want to pump the contrast a bit more, so I take the dark sea blue and just outline some of the recesses. The arms have this padded piping effect on it that feels like an undersuit, so I decided to use my usual undersuit painting method for Space Marines, starting with a base coat of black. I then make sure to cover all but the recesses with ash grey. This is quite a jump, but that's okay because the recesses here are deep. It's becoming a recurring theme now, but mixing in more and more Arctic blue, I start to highlight each individual tube, getting progressively smaller and smaller to create a line going from the shoulder to the hand. When we reach the pure Arctic blue, we put just a tiny dot on each tube. The same method here was used for the undersuit as well as a chest and inner leg. Only we're covering a wider area as I don't want this to read as reflective. Cassandra seems to have some kind of rope coming from her, so I decided to paint that like it was a golden rope. Starting with a base layer of brown level and dark sea blue, we take care to avoid all the areas we've done so far, as this is going to be a pain to fix later. To highlight the rope, we mix in more and more soul yellow until we get to the highlight points, which in this case here is just going to be pure soul yellow. If there is one thing I would change about this model, it would be how I painted the face. It didn't come across great. I'm not really happy with it and can do better. But thankfully, this takes up such a small section of the mini, it isn't really visible in the final photos. That's a pretty big advantage to photo competitions. You can hide stuff in your composition. Beige red is the base coat with a tiny bit of dark sea blue mixed into it. I then come in over it with pure beige red before mixing in more and more basic skin tone. I'm following the shapes of the face here up poorly. Off camera, the eyes are outlined black, then a white line in the centre before the irises are dotted with black again. I need to do some serious practice as painting faces again. Now, if I hated the face, I love what I did with the hair. Never have I ever painted hair this well. It starts with a base of dark sea blue, covering all the areas. I then mix in more and more Caribbean blue as I start to draw tiny lines in the direction the hair is going to be flowing to really sell the look. I'm not just highlighting the volumes that exist here, I'm drawing additional ones in as well. Pay special attention to the parting in the centre of her hair. Don't cross over it. The hair is pulling out from this centre parting. I do the same process with straight Caribbean blue again, all over the hair, not worrying about highlight placement, just trying to get depth and volume into the hair. I then start to mix in pastel green into the Caribbean blue, and I do the same lines, but this time here we're focusing in two areas. A line about 25% of the way down from the parting, and another line on the flick of her hair. These are going to be my shimmer points. I mix in more and more pastel green, getting smaller and smaller until that pure pastel green doing the most extreme highlights with almost dots. Finally, the hair is washed back with Caribbean blue, just to pull the extreme highlights back down a bit and smooth out all the transitions. The gun is painted similar to the undersuit, but with more of an emphasis on grey and not showing as much black. I also want to do a bit of texture here to show it's been beaten up and used. I start with a base coat of ash grey before the sections of the gun I want to be glowing are going to be covered in Arctic blue. Mixing in Arctic blue to the ash grey, I start the highlight process, pulling thinned paint towards the area of the gun I want to be reflecting more light. For me, this is the tips and tops of the gun. Each section is treated individually, so it comes together in the end. I also use each colour with slightly thicker application to draw lines and stippling across the gun as well, to act as battle damage. The process is repeated again, this time with more Arctic blue added, and I don't ever get up to full Arctic blue here because I don't want it to read as white. Some of the areas are then picked out with edge highlighting to make them pop even more, but as I'm not doing the heavy metal style of painting here, I've only focused these towards sections pointing upwards. Finally, with Cassandra, I wanted some way to showcase that I can do OSL. The weapon seems to have these sections on it that feel different. I'm not sure what they are, so I made them an energy source. Previous bits which were covered in the Arctic blue are now painted over with Caribbean blue, before mixing in more and more pastel green until we get up to pure pastel green. Highlights of a gem are focused towards the centre, getting progressively smaller and smaller until a dot, and on the barrel the same process is done, focusing the brightest sections towards the centre of each of them. The OSL is completed by adding overspill lighting onto the lovely painted gun. This is just a glaze, but it might require a couple of layers. It doesn't have to be much, but it should be much lower intensity than the light source. That's the big trick to OSL. The brightest section of it should always be the light source. And with the power of editing, we can go back in time and paint the base. I start with the ground texture. This is covered in brown leather mixed with a bit of dark sea blue. Don't worry too much about overspill here, we want to be a bit messy. I then mix in more and more sky blue into this and start highlighting up. For this, I'm stippling over everything. I want this to appear more natural texture, so this is something new I'm trying out. After a couple of layers of this, I decide down the line I want to cover most of this, but this is an important reminder. Bases are built up in layers, so this will act really nicely as an earth texture we can build off of. I then move on to all the rocks, the sculpted rocks and the cork rocks. I cover them in rainy grey before mixing in a bit of sky blue. Don't use too much blue here, as we still want this to read as grey. After that, I mix in some Arctic blue and just start to push the values even more. A couple of washes over the base, first of dark sea blue, focusing on the shadows, and then brown leather in areas that just feel right, to break it up and give some variety. I start the process here of painting the darker grey sections, just so I can see what it's going to look like as I get towards it, but this is going to be covered later. We now need to do more stippling, this time with dark green and dark sea blue mix. I stipple the whole ground texture with this. I wanted the base to feel more alive, and unfortunately just leaving it brown wouldn't do that. A couple more layers of stippling. I'm focusing these more and more towards the highest sections of the base, where it feels like it's going to catch the light. First with just dark green, then with dark green and Caribbean blue mixed in, Only the very tops are then done with pure Caribbean blue. This is used incredibly sparingly. As with the brown earlier, the shadows are then rebuilt with a wash of dark sea blue in just areas that feel like they need more shadow. Darker elements of the base are now painted. They were based earlier with ash grey, but not worrying about full coverage gives me some interesting painted textures I can play off. I come in with mixing more and more Arctic blue into this mix. In fact, this recipe is very similar to the gun because it's the same recipe. I use stippling on some of the texture layers with a light mix, and then applying a glaze over the top of it as well, I work these textures back into the general feel of the parts. This gives me a sort of very painterly approach to the surfaces overall. A texture of Arctic blue and sky blue is stippled onto the base white sections, and then it's all just one colour, Arctic blue. This is applied over and over as a middle sort of thickness glaze, and this builds up opacity. You can see as the layers build up, the opacity goes up, and we're maintaining this painterly texture we had in the darker grey. I'm trying to keep the brush strokes here going in the direction of the steps or towards the top of the wall, so there's some coherency and order in how it was painted. After this, the line of the steps is painted and highlighted in the same way the grey sections were. Then tying it into the dilapidated feel by stippling over the top with my Arctic blue. This sort of just pulls it in and makes it look like the paint is chipping off versus being fresh. With all the painting done, now it's time to move on to my favourite part of basing, where we get to apply all the finishing touches, the flora and fauna. For this, I'm using GSW bits to set the mood. I picked these up at Salute last year and have been waiting for an opportunity to use them properly. I picked some out that feel like they're in scale and with coherent colours to what I'm going for. They are then just bent to shape with tweezers and superglued into position. I'm trying to place all the bigger bits where animals would be less likely to walk. Large animals won't walk under the steps or really that close to them, so these are where the larger elements would be. I used tufts here and there as well, but rather sparingly as the colours feel a bit off. Now, all these laser cut plants have this horrible white line on them, so I take dark sea blue and start to edge highlight every single one of them, just to hide that white. At the same time, the tufts feel too green, so I take the dark sea blue and apply it very thinly over the top of them to tint them and pull them more towards the green colours. It also helps to knock down the colours of the very vibrant plants I've used. Applying paint over your tufts after you've finished it is fine. A quick pinning later and Cassandra is locked in place. I wanted a bit more texture in some places on the steps, so I did that off camera using the same methods as described. Specifically, some of these plants required texture in the centre as it just looked off and unnatural. I take some final pictures and cry as the light's reflecting horribly off the plants, but this is nothing a bit of matte varnish can't fix. And with that, the piece is done, the final pictures are retaken, and we can cue the showcase reel. This has been a fantastic project for me, and I'm really happy with how she turned out. This has kind of given me the drive to start playing Infinity and give them a spiel this year, and hopefully they've got the new starter sets there. I'm going to be picking it up and see what I can do with it. If you've liked this video, please drop a like and share and let me know what you thought your favourite bit was. Also, if you want to see more longer videos like this covering how I build my little vinaigrettes and dioramas, then let me know in the comments. They take much longer to make and edit, but I feel like I have a lot more creative freedom with them. But I'd be interested to know your thoughts. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.